All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take a look at the final information in section 4.4, which is water pollution. So this goes along with our eutrophication information. So really, we've already talked about 4.1 and 4.4, and then we're going to go back and talk about 4.2 and 4.3 before we wrap up the year. So I need you to make sure that you're following along in the textbook as well, because you will do best if you read the textbook and make sure you go through the examples in there as well, just as reinforcement. So today, to start off, there should be a lot of familiar information from previous units, but start off by listing as many sources of water pollution as you can think of, and then try and figure out how we could try to reduce each of these pollutants. So pause here, do that, and then come back. Okay, so now we're going to get into categorizing water pollution specifically. So if we look, there's anthropogenic. So the term anthropogenic should be familiar to you for meaning that it's caused by people, or there's natural. So we have one image that is very, very clearly anthropogenic, so it's human caused, it's just trash piled up in the water along the shore. On the other hand, to the right we have this red tide. So you can see the color is actually quite brilliant. So we see this red tide, it's a type of dinoflagellate, so like a plankton, that lives in the water. And we have this algal bloom, so that means there's a huge population of them growing within this area. And the question is, but is it really natural? So this is kind of getting you to think about the lab information. So of course, algae are naturally occurring, but their populations can vary depending on the nutrients in the water. So what we see is occasionally there are natural swings within the population, and it's natural for algae to grow, maybe in the spring or in the wet season when there's a lot more runoff of nutrients from the land into the water. However, this big bloom might not be so natural, so it could be caused by introduced pollutants, specifically nutrient pollutants or eutrophication to the water as well. So this should be extremely familiar. So there's point source and non-point source pollution. So I hope you'll be able to identify this already. But just as a review, remember point source means we can definitely tell exactly where it's coming from. So we can see these tubes dumping water into an exact location. So that's a point source. The non-point source is less clear to identify the responsible party, if you will. So we might see runoff from the suburbs, from the city, from rural homes, from croplands, and animals as well into the water. And then we can't see exactly where it's coming from. Like there's no specific location where we could pin it on a map to say that it's coming from, in which case it's non-point source. Then there's organic versus inorganic. So organic just means it comes from some sort of living matter, right? So you could think of fecal matter is organic pollution, even though it's extremely dangerous at times. On the other hand, on the right, we have chemical fertilizers. So you can see this person just tossing chemical fertilizers, like in the form of pellets, onto, I'm guessing this is probably a rice paddy. If you look, I don't even know if this person's wearing gloves, so that's not good. But anyway, so this is just the inorganic pollution. So that's created in a factory, okay? It's just chemical components. Then there's direct versus indirect. So direct means it's going directly into the water, so we know that this tube is directly dumping pollutants, whatever that is, directly into the water. Whereas on the right, we see the eutrophication. The pollutants that are entering the water were never intended to enter the water. Like they were intended perhaps to be pesticides or to be fertilizers for the soil, in which case they were never supposed to have been in the water, but they did indirectly filter their way there through runoff. So possible sources of water pollution. I'm going to upload this presentation. I do want you to watch some of it because it's really watch some of the video clips that are associated with some of them, because it is good information just to review. So we've got all sorts of stuff, like organic and inorganics. We've got sewage, pesticides. Pesticides, remember, are just, it's really any group of chemicals that are designed to kill something specifically, and usually we're talking insects. Industry dumps things. Pathogens, so pathogens are just anything that causes a disease. We got nitrates, phosphates, heavy metals, which can be extremely dangerous to health. Oil spills, so there's a link here to an oil spill that you might even remember with it happening within your lifetime. Heat, so this would change the environment if we change the temperature of the water as well. Radioactive waste, so highly dangerous to people as well. We've got solid domestic waste like trash. That was the image where we had the floating plastic in the water by the shore. And suspended particles. So this is actually considered a form of pollution as well. So if we have unusual amounts of suspended particles, that changes the clarity of the water, that's considered pollution. And then we have invasive species. Even though the vast majority of the number of species that people discussed in some of their projects had nothing to do with water-related species. So there were a few frogs in some of the classes, but there's actually a lot of invasive species in waterways, and that has influenced a lot of the native populations as well. So you can take a look at this video clip, and it just runs through, I think, like top 10 or something, invasive species in the water. So effects. So we say causes and we have effects. We've got eutrophication. So remember, eutrophication was a nutrient pollution. With enough nutrient pollution, we'll get the algal bloom, which will eventually lead to a very low oxygen water zone. Okay, that is also highly polluted, so chemically polluted as well. Loss of biodiversity, increase in diseases and pathogens, which is bad for us, right? We don't want diseases and pathogens in our water that we might want to consume or use for something else. Bioaccumulation, biomagnification. There's a video link here of the Minamata, which we talked about previously in Japan. So this is a good way to jog your memory. So I might click that as well. Disruption of the feeding grounds, nesting sites, right? So the things that live there are not going to be able to continue life as normal. Damage to coral reefs, which is happening extensively within these days, and damage to organisms. And we've talked about the microplastics and that how microplastics are being ingested by all sorts of organisms, and we're not totally sure what the cause of that will be. So how do we figure out the water pollution situation? So we can directly measure certain things. We can directly measure the pH, so that's whether the water is acidic or basic or neutral. And we can directly measure the amount of nitrates or ammonia. So ammonia is a nitrogen-containing molecule. So when we talk about nitrates, it's tied to ammonia. We can also, by the way, directly measure phosphates. We can measure the dissolved oxygen directly, though it's a little bit challenging. And we can measure conductivity, turbidity, and we can do a fecal coliform test. So that's pretty much, we're looking for like fecal bacteria and fecal matter within the water. So that is a possibility. There are also indirect measures, so they can indirectly measure the biochemical oxygen demand. So this is just the amount of oxygen required to break down all the organic matter within the water. And that gives us an indication of how healthy the water is. And it's kind of an extensive process. I'm going to click a little bit more. So in order to do this, let's see, did I get more information? I did. Okay, sorry. Just wanted to see where I stopped off there. So this is telling us about the health of the water. It's quite a process, so there are other ways to look at the oxygen levels and the health of water in more simple ways. But the material within the water can break down aerobically, so in the presence of water, and when that's not going to happen, when that's no longer capable, then things can be broken down anaerobically. So that's without the presence of water, or sorry, without the presence of oxygen, because remember, there's dissolved oxygen in water. If there's an anaerobic situation for decomposition, you might get some real nasty water. So this says it can contain methane, which is flammable, by the way, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia. And, so this might mean that the body of water might actually even stink. It might have a gross, unpleasant odor if you were to walk by it. You definitely would not want to go swimming in there. So how do you do this? Well, you can take a sample, you can take the initial measurement, and then you can kind of put the sample away in the dark for 5 days. And then you take another sample, and then you make a comparison of the amount of oxygen in the first one, and then the amount of oxygen in the second one. You have to take into account the volume as well. The most important thing for you to know is that natural water should actually contain less than 5 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen, and the higher this number, the higher the pollution. So that's the general rule. So then, what other measures can we gather or can we get in order to learn more about the health of water? Which, by the way, this might be useful for your Group 4 project, depending on what you chose. One is that certain organisms live in different types of environments. So some of them live in healthier environments and are more sensitive to pollutants than others. So we have these 4 different organisms, and I just wanted you to guess like which ones live in healthy water and which ones live in typically like unhealthy water. Okay, so take a guess, and then if you look at it, the bottom 2 actually are associated with high quality water. So amphibians have really, really, really sensitive skin. So if there's lots of pollutants, it'll really easily get into their body and cause damage. This is a mayfly. This mayfly is associated as well with really high quality water. So these are indicators of good water quality. Whereas at the top, we have organisms that are associated with not so good quality of water. So this is just recapping that same information. So the water louse, and it's called a sludge worm, which sounds disgusting. So this is the sludge worm. This is the water louse. Okay, they're associated with poor water quality. So measuring water pollution. So we have these different organisms that live in different situations. Please note that in the extremely, extremely polluted zone, no life can be supported. And then there's more, and this is also in our textbook, and the images might be slightly different, but there's more images of organisms associated with high quality water. So we're starting off with our higher quality water and then our lower quality water. Of course, we might need to consider the population as well. So we might have a really high population of organisms in the group A, which would indicate good water quality, and we might still see a few organisms in the group B and the group C, but we need to consider the relative abundance in order to determine the overall health of the water. So you might need to do some biodiversity calculations there. So measuring water pollution, right? We can use these biotic indices. So this would be looking at the different biotic factors, so thinking about the living organisms and thinking about whether or not those indicate good water quality or not. So it says it can often be used with the BOD. So we can do more than one test. So if you were to do an IA on water quality, you'd probably want to do more than one type of test in order to determine the health of the water system. Okay. Of course, you can use the Simpsons Diversity Index to compare 2 different ecosystems, which would be, again, probably a really pretty good IA. And then thinking about the effects of the pollutants on the biodiversity. Actually, I mean, this would be a wonderful IA guide right there. Then we have eutrophication. So we already looked at eutrophication. So this is just a recap. Eutrophication includes that red tide. So it's not just fresh water. It is also salt water that is impacted by eutrophication. So this is showing a dead zone that exists within the Gulf of Mexico, just really, really close to the Mississippi shore. Okay, so this is an area of concern. Red tides, and I'm running out of time, so I might need to start a little second video.